Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining me, and I understand that it's at relatively short notice, but thank you for joining me this evening. We'll start with an acknowledgement of country, and we acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners and custodians of the country on which we gather. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. In a spirit of humility and reconciliation, we commit ourselves again to listening to the ancient wisdom that resides in the dreaming of Australia's First Nations peoples, so that we may learn to live in harmony with one another and with the land that is our common home. And as always, we'll start with a prayer in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. We turn to you, our God, creator and sustainer of all, the one whose life animates all living things, the one whose being we all share. Be our wisdom, be our light, be our listening, be our seeing, be in us the kindness others seek, be in us the gentle love that forgives, be in us justice, peace, courage, creativity, life. Be in us now and always. Amen. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, pray for us. Live Jesus in our hearts forever. In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, as I said, ladies and gentlemen, welcome and thank you for attending. For those who may or may not be aware, I don't want to sort of pretend that everyone knows who I am, but my name is Mark Reedy. I will be directly in charge of the Urban Engagement Program for next year. What I did want to do before we started, just to remind you, there is a Q&A function here, and one of the things I thought I'd start with is by just simply asking you if you'd like to use the Q&A function to just put forward any questions that you have, and I'm fairly sure that I will address them, but it's probably good for me to get a sense of what information people want to know, and I'll arguably provide you with much more than you need to, but if you have a few moments just to type in any questions you might have. While you're doing that, I do want to talk a little bit about some of the rationales for why we've done the process of creating an urban engagement program. And of course, everything that we do stems from our four touchstones. You can see them there. I'm sure you're familiar with them. The idea of liberating education, gospel, spirituality, inclusive community, and justice and solidarity really imbues everything that we try and do with the boys. And secondly, of course, our logo with our motto, Desire et agere, to learn and to do. I think are critical parts of what we've put into our urban engagement program. In terms of my own thoughts about what we're doing and why, I'd like to put forward to you some ideas that sort of have fed into some of the work we've done with our Year 9s. For most of us, certainly me, my educational experience as a student was being involved in an extremely traditional classroom where it would look similar to what you're seeing here, probably not without the vibrantly coloured desks, but essentially the layout was essentially the same. We're all sitting in rows, we're looking at the front of the board, the teacher's there talking to us, and this is typically what a lot of learning spaces are like, and it's been that way for many, many years. And so what we're used to, I suppose, in a traditional classroom is the idea of face-to-face instruction. The teacher is the person who guides and directs everything, and all the communication is sort of face-to-face. This, of course, lends itself to students being able to learn, and of course, obviously I learned because I managed to get through schooling, and almost everyone of my vintage managed quite well with this. But one of the things that does happen when you have this sort of traditional classroom is that it doesn't really suit everyone. And so people tend to drift away from their education because it doesn't fit with who they are. When I first came across this, it really struck me as really important. It was one of the things that we do as teachers is we examine exactly how learning works. And this pyramid, I think, is really instructive. Essentially what it's showing, of course, is that passive teaching methods, and they're listed there, so things like lecturing, reading, audiovisual, things where the boys or the students can just sit and not be actively engaged, isn't particularly helpful for retaining knowledge. And so most students would not gain a great deal from this. The 5% part there is you know, one of the major concerns, I guess, for the ways universities run their training programs, and the reason why they've changed the way that they approach their learning. What research has shown, of course, is that teaching activities or teaching methods that directly involve students has a much higher knowledge retention rate and a much deeper understanding of what students are learning. And so what we're really wanting to do is have an opportunity for the boys to become much more engaged in what they're doing. As I was researching this a number of years ago, one of the things that came up for me was how positive students are about their schooling. And you can see there some of the changes that might occur as students go from year 6 through to year 9, and you can see that drop off there in percentage of students who feel good about school, you know, their attitudes towards teachers, their attitudes towards being in school, and their general work ethic tends to drop off. And really that's probably not much of a surprise to people who have had teenage sons before. Some of the research has come out about this. You know, students starting to have negative attitudes towards school towards the end of primary school. The peak dissatisfaction is in year 9. Here's another one from 2007, repeated in 2010. Middle years of schooling have been identified as a transition period. Disengagement with education is particularly likely. Generally, year 9 is seen to be the year where the purpose of schooling is the least clear. Students don't understand why they're there and are finding it difficult to remain engaged. And this one in particular, a strong pattern of underachievement in the middle years and disengagement from school, particularly for boys. All of these things lead to this sort of understanding that students' enthusiasm for school drops off dramatically and only picks up a little bit once they get past year 9. And that pickup there is almost certainly because the boys are getting a much more, I suppose, clear sense of what they want to do and are seeing the purpose of their education more clearly, though it never really climbs back to those early halcyon days of kindergarten where essentially kids love coming to school. I would point out, of course, that you know, this is not the absolute rule for everyone. You know, at least a third of the kids, even in year 9, absolutely love coming to school. They really see the purpose of it, and they will do particularly well. It's the concern, I suppose, for the remaining group that find being enthusiastic about school difficult. And one of the reasons is that it's often very same, and you know, things work the way they always do. So realistically, you know, year 9 is a time of transition where young boys in particular are moving from a point where they're no longer the little kids in the school, but they're not the big kids either. They're moving towards being an adult and moving towards being more independent, but they're not quite there yet. They want to be independent, but are often afraid to really make that step. This whole idea around this time of transition was really the point behind the development of Santa Monica in its original format. So Santa Monica was developed because it was an opportunity to take boys away, put them into an environment that was completely different, and allow them to develop the strength of character, the independence, to become more resilient and rely upon themselves, but also learn to rely on others more. and is often seen, and you see there in my little quotation, bridge to adulthood. It's the experience that almost every student that we have coming through Year 12 references as they leave as being, hugely, formative for them and really important. And so hugely influential, but essentially an isolated experience. Now, when your sons were enrolled at St Bernard's, we were discussing at that time extending the Santa Monica experience into essentially a full term's worth. In the end, the change to the Santa Monica campus became exorbitantly expensive, and so we were unable to continue with that. And by expensive, I mean more expensive by a factor of 10 times than what was originally thought. So our thoughts shifted to a way in which we could perhaps meet the commitments we made in terms of making our experience a broader one, but without really extending that time away and making life more difficult for students and the way in which they can interact with what we're doing. So our Santa Monica campus is now entirely really focused on the outdoor education experience that it involves. What we're trying to do in the city experience is to do some of the things that are shown here as being hugely important in terms of developing lifelong learners, particularly for students who are becoming more and more disengaged because they don't see the point of their schooling anymore. And so what we're trying to do is all of these things, the building of student-teacher relationships, trying to make the learning more challenging rather than just a ho-hum experience, trying to bring together problem-solving tasks that cross over a number of curriculum areas, and really not just problem-solving tasks, but authentic ones that require them to really think, but also to provide the boys with time to explore and really delve into some of those things. And while they're doing that, of course, our expectation will be in the city that they will work together, they'll develop that cooperation and teamwork and really work on their social competencies, being able to function in the city, which is actually sort of central point to often a lot of our lives. It also allows for us to really focus in on those individual differences and allow us to tailor what we're doing with each group of boys and each individual student to better suit what their interests and achievements and learning styles are. So we're sort of working our way through the reasons behind what we're doing, and then we'll start to look at the actual program itself. Essentially what I'm wanting to do, though, is make the learning process in the city much more applied. And so the boys are active participants in their learning and developing the skills that will allow them to continue doing that as they move up into the senior year levels. So just a reminder about this learning pyramid. We're wanting the experience in the city to be very much an experiential one. The boys are actively engaged and making decisions for themselves about how to approach things. So let's start to talk a little bit about the program itself. Really what we're trying to do is open the boys' eyes. They live in a suburb which is very, very close to the city, but I really get the sense in talking to our Year 9 boys, not your boys, but our Year 9 boys, that very few of them actually have a strong understanding of the way the city functions and what actually goes on there. They may be able to navigate their way to the MCG or to Marvel Stadium. They'll know the major train stations, but realistically, most of them do not spend a great deal of time in the city at all. And what we're trying to do is open their eyes to, as I've said here, the many faces of Melbourne. There's an aspect of Melbourne that will resonate with every single student in one form or another, and allowing the boys to explore This, I think, is a critical part of what we're trying to do. I'd like to take you through the way the program itself will work on a week-by-week basis, and then sort of drill down to what a typical day might look like, and then we'll talk about assessment and how that will work with what we're doing. So you may have seen in the handbook that I sent out to everyone that we're trying to focus each week on a different touchstone. And so week one, the idea of liberating the boys from a straitjacket classroom and allowing them opportunities to explore a much broader aspect of their life and an introduction to Melbourne. Very first thing we'll be doing with the boys is working through what we'll call a barriers activity, and the whole point of this is working with them to identify and having them identify, okay, what are the opportunities, but also what are the risks that might surface as they're moving around in the city, and how might they deal with this. I think it's important that they have a clear understanding of ways in which they can deal with particular situations they're likely to come into. I get a sense sometimes that one of the concerns that parents might have is, will my son be safe in the city? And the reality is the city is extremely safe. I was in there on Thursday with a group of Year 12s, and the city is literally flooded with school students in school uniform, doing exactly the sort of thing that we will be doing. It's certainly not an unusual thing to have students going into the city for this sort of experience. I think what is a little bit unusual is that ours is going to be reasonably extensive and allow students some significant time to really get their teeth into what they're doing. So realistically, the first part of the program, week one, is about opening up the students' eyes to different aspects of the city. And so there'll be a series of guided activities where the boys will go off in groups of 4 to explore, following a series of instructions to work their way around and get a sense of, one, how to travel around the city easily and plan their way around, and then the activities themselves will introduce them to various activities from those many faces of Melbourne. You'll note here that I'm saying here that these groups will be allocated, and one of the reasons we'll do this is because I want the boys to get a sense of how well they work in allocated groups versus self-chosen ones. And typically what boys will find if they do this is they actually work better in allocated groups rather than self-chosen ones, which surprises them. But that's, research has shown that to be quite the case. The allocated groups will be developed based on some work with the boys' current year level leaders, so that we're working on the people who actually know the boys and know who's likely to work well together and who won't. If your son is upset by the group that he's allocated in, I would ask, first of all, that you don't go into bat for him. I'd ask that he discuss that with me, but really part of the learning process here is that the students get a sense of being able to work with different people, because in real life they're not going to be able to pick and choose who they work with, and one of the skills that they will develop is that ability to negotiate. They certainly won't be left on their own to negotiate, but this is part of the learning process. We'll have typically in each week a number of whole class excursions where we'll go as a group to particular things. Much of this first week is going to be, though, about working in small groups to get a sense of exactly what is in Melbourne. Though we will have one whole class excursion focused on Flagstaff Gardens and Birrarung Ma, and a real focus there on Indigenous Melbourne before we begin. One of the things the boys will be asked to do as they're moving around is keeping their eyes open on being aware of what's going on around them, because as we get towards the end of week one, we'll be asking them to work with their allocated groups on their first assessment task, which is the big question. Now, we'll talk more about assessment later on and we'll detail what those things are, but their first task is going to be due by the end of week 2. So week 2, we shift the focus to gospel spirituality, and our theme for this week is going to be giving, and we'll try and fix in a couple of whole class excursions. One will be to the Shrine of Remembrance and one will be the City Mission City Walk. I should point out that no two programs are going to be exactly alike. There are so many different opportunities and different variations and activities that can be done in the city that I really want to explore these as much as I can with as many groups as we can. And so a lot of the focus will be on the class excursions, but then the boys will have those opportunities to work on their big question project, which will involve them planning where their group is going, who they're going to talk to, what information they will gather, and then working together to create a presentation which they will show to you at the end of our program, and more about that later. Week 3, our touchstone for this is justice and solidarity, and the theme is going to be sustainability, and again a number of whole class excursions, but this week we move into a passion project where the boys will be allowed to select their own groups and decide on a project that appeals to them, that delves into a particular aspect of Melbourne. Again, we'll talk more about these assessment tasks as we go further along. And then finally, week 4, the touchstone of inclusive community, and our theme will be culture. There's a number of activities again, or whole class excursions. The culmination of all of this though will be on the last day, the Friday. We will have essentially the students' Year 9 retreat experience, which will have an Indigenous theme, and they'll be completing their work on their passion project. And critically, on the very last day, we're seeing this as a family celebration day where parents and caregivers will be invited to come in the early evening, take part in the mass. The boys will present their work to you, and then there'll be a family meal to wind up the whole experience. I'm very much looking forward to having you come in and see what the boys have done. So we've talked about the assessment. There's actually 3 assessment tasks. The big question, which is in allocated groups, there's a passion project in self-selected groups, and there's an ongoing individual task of reflective journaling, which we'll talk about in a little while. I guess one of the key things that we want the boys to have with this is that while we're taking them away from their normal schooling and their normal classes, we are still retaining a literacy and numeracy focus. The literacy focus will come specifically out of the reflective journaling. I'll talk more about the numeracy focus in a little while. But let's talk about exactly what we're looking at in terms of why we're assessing what we're assessing. While the Victorian curriculum dictates what particular areas of learning are dealt with in Year 9, there are a number of overarching capabilities which generally don't fall into a particular subject and are expected to be dealt with, broadly across all of the subjects. One of the problems with this, of course, is that because there's no specific subject for personal and social capabilities, often the assessment of these things is pretty much given lip service, and we want to try and step away from that and have an assessment process that really focuses in on these. And so the key capabilities that we really want to assess are these ones that are listed there. So personal and social, intercultural, ethical and critical and creative thinking capabilities. There will be some curriculum areas that we deliberately focus on, so civics and citizenship and digital technologies, but also, of course, we'll be touching on so many different curriculum areas as we go through, and in particular probably in the humanities area, but certainly a number of other areas. So, assessment task 1. We're going to ask the boys to investigate a particular issue that is either problematic or actually really positive about Melbourne and about living in a big city. It's one of the reasons why, as they're doing the exploration process in week 1, that we really want them to keep their eyes open and thinking about what it is that they're seeing, rather than just sort of wandering through, actually seeing what's happening around them and then using that as a basis for, okay, investigating some of those issues. We'll provide some possible topics. Other things may occur to the boys based on what they are seeing around town as they travel. But some of the key things would then be some guiding questions to help them to develop an answer to this big question. The actual outcome of this will be the boys developing a presentation with a display board which explains their findings. And so a key part of this will then be them working on what is their issue, what sort of things they need to find out, gathering their information, perhaps having surveys, taking note of particular things, and then melding this all together into a display which they will have up in the foyer of our venue for parents and their classmates to have a look at as they're as we're finding out on the last night. The second task, the Passion Project, this is self-selected groups of 4. What they're asked to do is choose one of the faces of Melbourne and then conduct an in-depth exploration of, and I'm really wanting to focus in on a very specific feature of that aspect of Melbourne. The big thing I want to avoid, I suppose, is they just do an obvious thing. I really want them to delve deeply and find something that's of interest to them in a particular area or a particular aspect of life and really delve into that in depth. And their findings for this will be presented as a 10-minute documentary. So I'm thinking in terms of the boys writing scripts, interviewing people, taking footage, and then using their laptops to meld this into a final presentation. And that's where the digital technology stuff comes in, of course. And then finally, their ongoing individual task, which is their journal reflections. And essentially, what we're doing here is, one, trying to deal with the literacy aspects of maintaining that sort of aspect of their learning, but also using this as a debrief mechanism. The boys will be seeing lots, they'll be experiencing lots, and the journaling provides an opportunity for them to just debrief a little bit, to think about what they're seeing and feeling and experiencing, and to write down what's going on. Now, this will be scaffolded and there'll be guiding questions provided to assist with the structure of this. And one of the things we'd be asking is that they share this with you so that you have a sense of what's going on with them. I thought I'd put in a lot of the guiding questions to give you a sense of how that was going. But anyway, that there will be an opportunity for the boys to bring this home on a daily basis and share with you what's going on. I think that's going to actually be really critical, that there's an opportunity for one. We will debrief with them at the end of the day, but also it's probably wise for you to have conversations with your son when he arrives home. Our venue will be at the Catholic Theological College. Now, you note here 4 days a week. So Mondays, Wednesdays, Thursdays and Fridays we will be in the city. On Tuesdays we will be at St Bernard's as usual, and I'll talk more about that later on. Just to be aware, there will always be a staff member present at the college. So one of the reasons for this, of course, is that because a lot of the work that the boys are doing is going to be in small individual groups. Some groups will be out while others will be on site planning, working on their material, writing questions, trying to put their final product together, making decisions about where they need to go next. And so it won't be a situation necessarily where all of the boys are out at the same time unless we're going in on a class expedition. So there'll always be someone at the base there in case boys are coming backwards and forwards, and we'll talk about how that will be arranged in a minute. And there'll be a second staff member minimum who will also be out and about with the boys. I think though the key experience we want for the boys is that they are having more and more independence about what they're doing while they're out. But this will be all based on discussion with the staff members that are there. A typical day. Typically, we on any day that we're there, the boys will sign in by 9 AM. We'll then have a morning prayer and a reflection. Then we'll talk about what we're doing for the day. So whether that's a whole group activity or whether it's small groups, where they're going, what they're doing. During the day then, we'll either be out as whole groups or we'll have small groups with some out or all of them out, or a mixture of people at the base area or out exploring. And the whole point of this is gathering their information, working on their projects. At the end of the day, we'll have a specific time frame for journal writing and debrief. We'll have a discussion about the end, what's happening the next day, and then signing out at 3:30 PM. So this would be a typical day. On Tuesdays, we won't be in the city, we'll be at St Bernard's, and there's a couple of reasons for this, but primarily we don't want the boys to miss out on the opportunities to play representative sport. And I'm very conscious that the choice of Santa Monica term is often based around particular things that the boy wants to do, and the urban experience where we're working in the opposite semester, which can fly in the face of that, but of course it's a more local environment, and the boys are there and able to take part in what they need to. We want them to be able to continue to be part of our ACC or house sport activities. One of the things the boys will probably not be pleased to hear is that our period 1 and 2 lessons on Tuesday will be maths lessons. This is where we maintain the numeracy side of things. The maths department is preparing a consumer maths course for the 4 weeks, but I'm really keen to take the idea that we can have 2 periods of theory or a period of theory, and then based on what they've learnt in their theory, we then create a learning activity in the city to reinforce that. And I think consumer maths really fits in very well with that idea of linking things back to real life things in the city. Period 3 and 4, I'm looking at the boys being involved in community service activities, which will be based on the week's theme, whichever week that is. And then obviously period 5 and 6, they're off playing sport. What should we bring? All of this stuff is listed in the handbook, of course, so I'm not going to go into great detail about this. It's valuable for them to have their laptop, but they won't be taking their laptop out and around the city. The laptop will stay at CTC for the day, and if they're there at our base in the Catholic Theological College, then the boys will be able to use their laptop to prepare their work. And this will be the point where we have sort of Wi-Fi access for them to be on the internet. While they're out in the city, they're unlikely to have access to the internet unless it's through their phones. Now, of course, their phones will be with them, and this is actually a critical part. One, for communication, so they, if they need help, instructions, they're lost, they're late, whatever, they can be in contact with staff. And also, of course, the camera will be very useful for them. The boys should have some money, but not huge amounts. It's not expected that this be a hugely expensive activity. I'll talk more about things like food and stuff like that later, but they really shouldn't need a great deal of money. And part of our consumer maths approach to this will be looking at budgeting and what they're doing with their money. They will also need a Myki card to assist with getting around the city, though a lot of the time they will be walking, so they will end up being quite tired by the time they get home. And you're like, we need an exercise book for their journaling activities. What we will provide to all of the boys is an iPad and a stylus, which they can use for collecting information as they go out and about. These will live at CTC overnight and be charged up, but essentially the boys will have access to this. I don't want them wandering in the city with huge amounts of stuff. They should be able to travel light and quick and not have to be worrying about leaving things behind. So moving around very, very quickly and easily. Wi-Fi will be available back at the base, and of course there'll be workspaces for them to work there, either in our base room or in the library. What they shouldn't bring, we shouldn't need a large bag. If they're moving around in the city, a small bag with perhaps a water bottle, a bit of lunch if they brought it in, and their iPad and some writing utensils will be all that they need. They don't need to bring huge amounts of stuff in. Certainly anything that's hugely expensive shouldn't be with them, and anything that they don't really need for the program, there's not a lot of point in bringing stuff in just to carry it around. And if they've got it with them, it's in a distracting environment, it's easy for them to leave things behind. So not having them will be helpful for that sort of thing. In terms of attendance, we'll have a sign in, sign out approach. As I say, there'll always be someone at the base. We're expecting the boys will sign in when they arrive in the morning, and then if they go out during the day, they'll sign in again when they return. And so you can see they're signing out whenever they leave the base in a small group. They'll need to note down who's going, where they're going, who they're going to be interacting with, how are they going to get there, and when they're expecting to return. And they'll also sign out in the afternoon. Now, I would note, no one is going to be allowed to leave during the day alone. This will be either whole group with staff members or small groups with staff members or small groups independently. And the key part of this is that the boys get used to moving around the city independently, but certainly not on their own. There'll always be people with them. Now, in terms of absences and late, we'd have the same expectations as for attending at Essendon. We'd be expecting parents or caregivers to make contact, and we will have a school phone number provided to you at the start of the program, just letting me know, and you'll be contacting me if your son is going to be absent or late. Can I please ask, in our current environment, don't send your son in if he's unwell. And can I also ask that you avoid making appointments during the day, because it's going to impact on your son's group. And we're talking about boys going out in groups of 4. If we're taking a boy out, that makes it difficult for them. So if you can, please avoid making any appointments during the day. If there's a student whose arrival is unexpectedly delayed, I'd be expecting them to use their phone and contact me and tell me what's going on. And the same thing for any boys who are out on a planned outing. They've signed out, they've said they'll be back at a particular time, but something's happened to make them late. They need to be in contact with me, and that's part of that responsibility for themselves to make sure that they're following through on this. On some general matters, as I said, when we start the program, we'll talk about safety, but I would assure you that the city is a safe place. There are lots of people around. There are lots of students who are obviously students, and they're there moving around in independent groups doing their work. There'll be discussions with the boys about the fact that, they are likely to come across people who are different and how to respond to those things and those situations. And you would have seen in the handbooks and tips for the boys about how to deal with those sorts of situations. And that in itself is an important learning experience for them, but that will be discussed in detail with them before they're going out anywhere. A key part of the safety for the boys is the fact that they will be in uniform. They will be easily identifiable as students who are cared for as part of a school community, and the fact that they will be well dressed, one, opens doors for them. They'll quickly find that the city is very open to dealing with students, but open, I suppose, from an adult perspective, in that they will respond well to boys who present well and think through how they're going to approach people. And if they're doing it politely and look the part, the city people will be quite accommodating as a result. And so uniform will be our standard school uniform. And I think it's really important that they're identifiable as our students. In terms of food, one of the things we'll discuss as part of the consumer maths is just how expensive it can be if they're intending to buy their lunch every time they're in. And so part of this, of course, is that it's very easy to rack up a lot of expense on food in the city. And so it's probably important they really factor in bringing in their own lunch fairly regularly, in that buying of food is something that's done rarely. As part of our work with the boys, we'll be encouraging them, if they are going to buy something, that they don't just go straight to KFC, which I think will be their first tendency. But the reality is, of course, the city is awash with opportunities for trying different things, and typically it will be much cheaper if they do so. So that will be part of our learning from there. We've mentioned money, so the boys should not have a great deal with them. One final thing I do want to touch on is the idea of homework. This will be a little bit different. The boys are going to be tired. They'll be out a lot. They'll be walking a lot. They'll be seeing a lot. And so they'll need probably some time to decompress a little bit. And part of that will be done as part of our debriefing process at the end of each day. But the tiredness will be a real thing. On top of that, of course, a lot of what the boys will be doing will be this individual group work. And so the group members may amongst themselves divide up work that needs to be done. And so some of it will be related specifically to their group projects. And so what we'll find, of course, is that different groups will work in different ways. And so it won't be a case of there will be set homework, but there will certainly be pressure on the boys to produce their work, partly because they're going to have to show it to you at the end of our time. And one of the things that will be happening is they will be getting a sense of how other groups are working, and that in itself puts its own pressure on the boys to do well, and particularly when they're working on something that they have chosen to produce. This slide here, I'm just really trying to present to you that these are the things that we want the boys to achieve out of this. We want them to come with a growth mindset of, they won't know everything, but they will find out and they will develop. Certainly Santa Monica really taps into exactly the same thing, a growth mindset, and things like independence, responsibility, teamwork. It's really mirroring the aims of the Santa Monica program in a different environment. And I think the idea of real life learning experience is going to be extremely powerful for the boys as they experience this. And I guess the raising of awareness amongst the boys that the cities, it's all bright lights and lovely shops and all the rest of it, but it's also a lot of issues that surface there, and the opportunity for them to, one, be aware, and two, hopefully perhaps in a future part of their life, really working to do something about some of the issues that surface would be, I think, you know, a huge outcome for our program. Group 6 dates, you'll be starting on the 31st of January and ending on Friday the 25th of February. So basically the first 4 weeks will be with me in the city. And the particular date that I want parents and caregivers to be aware of is Friday the 25th of February. At this point, my planning is that our celebratory mass will begin around 5 p.m. and that will then have a presentation of the boys' work to the parent body, and then we'll end up with a family meal. The details of this are still being worked out as to how we'll do all this, but we'll provide much more information as the program begins next year. Okay, I'm probably glad I didn't wait for people to write questions, because no one's written any questions. Do people want to ask questions now? I'll give you a couple of minutes to write something down if you wish, or if you have no questions, then that will be it for the evening. Thank you very much for your attendance. Now, as always, this presentation is recorded, so I'll be posting this on the Year 8 year level page at the moment, because that's where all of the boys have access, so that you can review this later on if you wish. Okay, and I'm not being flooded with questions, so we'll call a halt there. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your attendance, and I look forward to seeing you all on the 25th of February for our family celebration. Thank you very much, and good evening.